A widowed mother and her 10-year-old son inherit a forgotten train depot at the edge of a dying town. What they discovered locked inside an old caboose at the end of the track didn't just save their lives. It gave them back a future they thought was buried with the man they loved. If you ever held a child's hand and wondered how you were going to get to the next hour, let alone the next year, if you've ever felt the terrifying weight of being the only thing standing between someone you love and the cold, then this story is for you. Sometimes the smallest hands hold the biggest hope, and sometimes hope arrives wearing rust. If this story speaks to something inside you, please subscribe. It tells me these stories are reaching the people who need them. The eviction notice was taped to the door with 3 pieces of cellophane tape, as if the apartment manager had been worried it might blow away in the breath of my own sigh. It hadn't. It had stayed there for 6 days while I tried to make $1,200 appear out of nothing. On the 7th day, I took it down and folded it into the back pocket of my jeans. And that was the day my son, Eli, asked me a question that broke something loose in my chest. "Mom," he said, looking up from the cereal he was eating dry because the milk had gone sour and I couldn't afford another gallon. "Are we going to be okay?" He was 10 years old. He had his father's eyes, that quiet, watchful gray that always seemed to be measuring the room before it spoke. And he was asking me a question I had been asking myself every night for 14 months. Ever since the foreman had come to our door at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hand and told me there had been an accident at the rail yard. "We're going to be okay," I said. I didn't know if it was true, but I had learned in those 14 months that there are some lies a mother has to tell, lies that aren't about deception, so much as they are about laying down a plank across a hole in the floor so a child can keep walking. His father, Daniel, had worked the long-haul freight lines for 9 years. He had loved trains the way some men love women, stupidly, devotedly, without explanation. He had been killed by a snap cable in a switching yard outside of Toledo. The settlement had been small, because the cable was old and the company's lawyers were not, and what came to me had been swallowed almost entirely by the medical bills from the days he spent in the hospital before he died. Eli had been 9 then. He was 10 now. He had grown 2 inches in those 14 months, and he had not laughed once that I could remember. Not really laughed. He smiled sometimes, polite smiles for teachers and for me, but the laughter had gone out of him the way a pilot light goes out, with a small click that you don't notice until the room turns cold. I packed our things into 38 cardboard boxes. Most of it I sold. Daniel's model trains I could not bring myself to part with. I wrapped each one in newspaper, and that tub came with us. We moved in with my sister Marlene for 3 weeks. Her 2-bedroom apartment was already housing 4 people. I slept on the couch, and Eli slept on a sleeping bag on the floor next to me, and at night I would lie awake listening to him breathe and counting the days until I had worn out our welcome. I worked 2 jobs, mornings at a diner, evenings cleaning offices in a 6-story building where the people who worked there during the day never saw the people who worked there at night. The math did not work. I would sit on Marlene's bathroom floor at 1 in the morning and add up the same numbers in different orders, and the answer was always the same answer, which was no. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was a thin envelope with a return address in a town I had never heard of, Brackenfield Junction. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looped, the kind of handwriting nobody learned anymore. It was addressed to Mrs. Sarah Whitlock. Underneath my name, in smaller letters, someone had written, "Wife of the late Daniel Whitlock, son of Margaret." I stood in Marlene's kitchen with the envelope in my hand for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet from a law office I had never heard of, Caldwell and Sons, attorneys, Brackenfield Junction. The letter said that a Mrs. Margaret Whitlock had passed away the previous month, and that I, as the surviving spouse of her only child, was the named beneficiary of her estate. It asked me to call at my earliest convenience. Margaret Whitlock, Daniel's mother. Daniel had told me, on our second date, that his mother had died when he was 16. He had said it the way he said most painful things, which was quickly and with his eyes on the table. He had told me his father had taken him east after that there had been some kind of falling out, that he didn't talk about it. I had been 22 and in love, and I had not pressed him. There are wounds you learn to walk around the edges of when you love somebody. But here, on this thin sheet of paper, was a different story. Margaret Whitlock had not died when Daniel was 16. She had died last month, which meant that for 31 years, my husband had believed something about his mother that was not true. I sat down on Marlene's kitchen floor with the letter in my lap, and I cried for the first time in a long time. I cried for Daniel, who had carried that grief through his whole short life. I cried for whatever family rift had been so deep that a mother had been told her son was gone, and a son had been told his mother was dead. And I cried because I was so tired, and because in the middle of my exhaustion, an envelope had arrived from a town I had never heard of, and it was the first thing in 14 months that wasn't a bill. I called the number that afternoon from the back room of the diner. The voice that answered was old and deliberate. His name, he said, was Henry Caldwell. He had been Margaret Whitlock's lawyer for 41 years. He was sorry for my loss, and he was sorry he had not been able to find me sooner. Margaret had only learned of Daniel's death 6 months before her own. She tried to find him for 30 years, Mrs. Whitlock, he said. She wrote letters that came back unopened. She hired a man once who couldn't find anything. The boy's father had moved them under a different name by the time she found out where Daniel was. He had been gone almost a year. I asked him what she had left me. There was a pause. I could hear papers shuffling on the other end of the line. She left you the depot, Mrs. Whitlock, the Brackenfield Junction train depot, and the parcel of land it sits on, about 11 acres along the old spur line. There's also some rolling stock on the property, a few cars. The depot has been closed since 1987, but Margaret lived in the old station master's quarters in the back. The taxes are paid through next year. There's a small bank account, just under $3,000, and there is a letter which she wrote to you. She had kept your wedding announcement, clipped from a newspaper, for 16 years. I held the phone against my ear, and I did not say anything. Mrs. Whitlock, he said gently, are you there? How? I said, and my voice came out cracked. How do I get there? He told me. He told me about the bus that ran twice a week from the city to the county seat. He told me he would meet me at the depot himself. And he told me, in a voice that was kind and careful, that the depot was not in the best condition, and that I should not expect too much. That night I told Eli. We were sitting on the sleeping bag in Marlene's spare room. He had his knees pulled up to his chin, and his arms wrapped around them, the way he sat when he was trying not to take up space. I told him about the letter. I told him about the grandmother he had never known. I told him about the train depot in a town we had never heard of. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, was it Dad's mom? Yes, I said, and she had trains. She lived at a train station, sweetheart. He looked up at me, and for a second, just a second, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since the foreman had come to the door 14 months before. It was small. It was barely there, but it was something. Mom, he said, can we go? The bus left at 5 in the morning. We sat together in the third row from the back, Eli with his backpack on his lap and his face pressed against the window. We had 2 suitcases between us, the tub of Daniel's model trains, and $312 to our name. The country opened up as we went north. The city gave way to suburbs, and the suburbs gave way to Tulane Road, and by mid-afternoon, we were passing through farmland that looked like it had been forgotten by the rest of the country. Cornfields left fallow, barns that had collapsed in on themselves like old men sitting down. Brackenfield Junction was a town of perhaps 400 people. The only stoplight in town blinked yellow in all 4 directions. The bus dropped us at the corner of Main and Depot Street, and a man in a brown suit was waiting for us under the awning of the post office. Henry Caldwell was 80 if he was a day. He was thin and stooped, and his hands shook a little when he held them out to take my suitcase. He looked at Eli for a long time without saying anything, and then he said very softly, he has Margaret's chin. We walked. The depot was at the far end of Depot Street, a half-mile out of town. He told us that Brackenfield had been a stop on the old Western Continental Line for almost 100 years, and that it had closed when the train stopped running in the 1980s. He told us that Margaret had lived there since 1971, that her husband Henry had been the last station master, and that after their falling out, when Henry took Daniel east, Margaret had stayed and bought the depot from the railroad herself. The depot came into view as the road curved. It was bigger than I had expected, 2 stories, with a long platform running along the front, and a gabled roof that sagged in the middle. The wood had been painted a dark red once, the color of old freight cars, but the paint had peeled away in long strips, leaving the boards beneath weathered to a soft, silvery gray. The sign above the main door, in faded white letters on a green field, read Brackenfield Junction, Yilly 1247. And behind the depot, on a short stretch of disused track that ran out into a field of tall grass, sat 3 rail cars. A boxcar, its sides covered in graffiti and rust. A passenger coach with most of its windows broken. And, at the very end of the track, a caboose, red, smaller than the others. The kind of caboose with a cupola on the top, where the brakeman used to sit and watch the train ahead of him. Eli stopped walking. I had been worried about Eli that whole bus ride. I had been worried about how he would handle this. Another move, another upheaval, another disappointment. He had handled so many already. I had been holding my breath, waiting for him to break. But Eli stopped walking, and he stared at those 3 rail cars sitting in the tall grass with the late afternoon sun behind them, and his mouth opened, and he said one word, "Mom." That was all, just my name. But the way he said it, you would have thought he was looking at the surface of the moon. He let go of my hand, and he ran. He ran through the grass and put his hand flat against the side of the boxcar, as if he were checking to see if it was real. Then he ran to the passenger coach and looked in through one of the broken windows. And then he ran to the caboose and stood at the foot of the small iron ladder, looking up at it with both hands on his head. Mr. Caldwell stood beside me on the path. We watched him. Margaret used to say, Mr. Caldwell said quietly, that those cars were the happiest things she owned. I could not speak. Mr. Caldwell took an envelope out of his coat pocket. It was thick and yellow with age. My name was written across the front in the same looped, old-fashioned handwriting. She wanted you to have this when you arrived, he said. I'll leave you to it. The keys are in the door. The caboose has its own key, and I never could find which one it was. Margaret kept that one separate, on a chain around her neck. She was buried with it. The depot smelled of dust and with smoke and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers pressed between the pages of a book. The main hall was a long room with a high ceiling and benches along the walls. The ticket window was still there, its brass grill tarnished but intact. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in the center of the room. Behind the main hall, through a low door, was the station master's quarters where Margaret had lived. A small kitchen with a white enamel stove, a sitting room with a single armchair, a bedroom with a quilt-covered bed, a bathroom that worked miraculously when I turned the tap. Eli ran from room to room, with his eyes wide. I followed him slowly. It was old, it was dusty, but it was clean. Margaret had been a tidy woman. The dishes were stacked neatly in the cupboard. The bed was made. There were books on a shelf, alphabetized. A pair of reading glasses sat folded on the kitchen table, as if she had set them down a moment before and would come back to pick them up. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages long. The handwriting grew a little shakier toward the end, as if she had written it over several days. Dear Sarah, it began. I am Margaret. I am Daniel's mother. By the time you read this, I will be gone, and so will Daniel. I learned of his passing 6 months ago from a man at the railroad who had served with him. I will not pretend I have any right to your grief. I lost my son the day his father took him from me, when he was 12 years old, and the man who died last winter was a stranger to me, although I loved him every day of my life. I will not waste your time with the story of why his father took him. There was an argument. There was a woman his father wanted to start over with. There was a court that took my child from me on the basis of accusations I could not afford to fight. By the time I understood what had happened, they were gone. I spent 8 years trying to find them. When I finally got close, I was told that Daniel had been informed I was dead and that I should let him believe it because it was what he had built his life around. I did not let him believe it because I agreed. I let him believe it because I was told that contacting him would do him more harm than the silence had already done. I have spent 31 years not knowing if that was true. Sarah, I am leaving you the depot because it is the only thing I have to leave, and because I have nobody else. But I am also leaving it to you because of something else. There is a caboose at the end of the track behind the depot. It was Henry's, my husband, Daniel's father, before he left. Before he became the man who took my child from me, a good man, or close enough to one. He was a railroad man, and he loved that caboose. He rebuilt it on weekends. He used to take Daniel out there and let him sit in the cupola and pretend to be the brakeman. After Henry left and took Daniel with him, I could not bring myself to go inside the caboose. I locked it, and I have not opened it in 39 years. Inside that caboose is everything I could not bring myself to look at. Daniel's things, the toys he left behind when his father took him, his clothes, the little books he was learning to read from. There is also a steel safe that Henry installed in the floor of the caboose when he was working on it. Henry was a careful man with money. He did not trust banks. Inside that safe is whatever was in it the day he left. I never opened it. I did not have the combination. He took the combination with him. But I knew him for 14 years. And I will tell you what I told myself for all the years I have not been able to look at it. Whatever is in that safe was meant for our son, and our son is gone. And I am giving it to you, and to your boy, who is also our boy in a way. The key to the caboose is around my neck. It will be buried with me. I am sorry. I could not bring myself to take it off. But there is a spare. Henry made a spare for everything. The spare is in the desk in the station master's office, in the drawer that sticks. You will have to lift the drawer up and out to open it. The spare is in a small tin labeled thread. Take care of my boys, Sarah. Take care of yours. Margaret. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. The light through the window had turned gold and then orange and was beginning to fade to gray. I could hear Eli upstairs, his footsteps moving from room to room as he explored. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I went to the station master's office. The desk was a heavy oak thing. I tried each drawer. 5 of them opened. The one that did not was the second one down on the left side. I pulled on it, and it stuck the way old drawers stick. I lifted the drawer up and out. Pencils, a magnifying glass, a roll of stamps, a tin box, the kind that sewing thread used come in, with the word thread printed on the lid in faded letters. I picked up the tin and shook it. Something inside rattled. I called Eli down. I sat him at the table, and I told him, as carefully as I could, what the letter had said about his grandmother, about his grandfather, who had not been a good man at the end, about the things they had left in the caboose, about the safe. Eli listened. He did not interrupt. When I was finished, he said, "Can I see her letter?" I gave it to him. He read it slowly, his lips moving a little around the longer words, the way they always did. When he was done, he folded it the way I had folded it, and he handed it back. "Mom," he said, "do you want to wait until tomorrow? It's getting dark." I had been about to say yes, but there was something in the way he asked, something careful, as if he had already figured out that tomorrow was for grown-ups, and that tonight, while it was still tonight, belonged to something else. "No," I said, "let's go now." I put on Daniel's old work jacket, the one I had taken from his locker at the rail yard and never been able to give away. I gave Eli a flashlight. I took the tin labeled thread and the key ring from the hook by the door, and we went out into the long blue evening, my son and I, and we walked across the platform and down the steps into the tall grass to the caboose at the end of the track. The grass was wet. It was up to Eli's waist in places. The caboose loomed above us, red and rust-streaked, its small windows reflecting the last of the daylight. The little iron ladder up to the rear platform was cold under my hand. Eli went up first. I followed. The door of the caboose was a small one, narrower than a regular door, and locked with a heavy padlock that had been weathered nearly black with age. I opened the tin from the desk. Inside, on a bed of cotton wadding, were 2 keys. One was small and brass. The other was iron, dark and pitted, and looked exactly like the kind of key that would open a 40-year-old padlock. I tried the iron key. It went in. It turned. The padlock fell open in my hand. I looked at Eli. He was watching me with his father's eyes, gray and serious in the dusk, his small hand wrapped tight around the flashlight. "Ready?" I said. He nodded. I pulled the door open. The smell that came out of that caboose is something I will remember for the rest of my life. It was a smell of cedar and of old paper and of machine oil and of dust that has been settled for so long it has become its own kind of substance. It was not a bad smell. It was a smell of something kept, something held. We stepped inside. Eli switched on the flashlight, and the beam swept across the small interior, and what we saw made us both stop breathing for a moment. The inside of the caboose had been a child's room, not a workshop, not a storage shed, a child's room, built-in bunks along one wall, with quilts still folded on them, a small desk under one of the windows, with a kerosene lamp and a row of children's books, their spines faded but readable, the little engine that could, Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel, a wooden toy chest at the foot of the bunks, a model train set up on a long shelf that ran the length of one wall, a complete loop with a tunnel through a papier-mâché mountain and a tiny station with tiny passengers waiting on the tiny platform, a pair of small overalls hanging from a hook, a pair of small boots underneath them. On the desk, a picture frame with a photograph of a young woman holding a baby. Margaret, I realized, holding Daniel. It was a room Henry had built for his son. Eli walked very slowly to the toy chest and knelt down in front of it. He opened it. Inside were toys. Wooden ones, mostly. A little carved horse. A set of building blocks. A stuffed bear that had been lulled into a state of permanent floppiness. And on top of the toys was a child's drawing of a train. A green crayon engine pulling a long line of red cars. At the bottom, in the large, careful letters of a child who is just learning to write, were the words, "For Mommy, from Daniel, age 5. I sat down on the floor of the caboose, and I wept. Not the small, controlled crying I had done in the kitchen, but the deep, uncontrollable kind of crying that comes from somewhere underneath grief, somewhere underneath even understanding. Eli came and sat beside me and put his small head against my shoulder and did not say anything. He just sat there with me while I cried for the man I had loved, and for the boy he had been, and for the mother who had lost him, and for the long, terrible silence between them. After a long time, I wiped my face on the sleeve of Daniel's jacket, and I looked around the inside of the caboose. In the floor at the far end, there was a steel plate the size of a large book, set flush with the boards and bolted at the corners. There was a small recessed handle in the center of it, a safe. I crawled over. Eli came with me. The handle would not turn. There was a combination dial above it, a heavy black thing with white numbers around the edge. Henry had taken the combination with him. I sat back on my heels. "Maybe," Eli said quietly. "We don't need to open it tonight." "No," I said. "Maybe we don't." We sat there for a while longer. Eli was looking at the model train on the shelf. He had not touched any of it. He was the kind of boy who understood, without being told, that some places are quiet places. "Mom," he said. "Yeah. My dad slept here." "He did," I said, "when he was a little boy." He nodded slowly. He looked up at the cupola. There was a ladder up to it. "Can I go up there?" he said. "You can go up there," I said. He climbed. He sat in the cupola, his small face in the last of the light, looking out at the field and the platform and the depot and the long, empty stretch of track that ran away into the trees. He sat there for a long time. I watched him from below. When he came down, his face was wet, but he was smiling. It was the first time I had seen him smile that way. Really smile, since the foreman had come to our door 14 months before. "Mom," he said, "I think I want to live here." We did not open the safe that night. We went back to the depot and we ate the sandwiches I had packed from Marlene's kitchen, and we slept on Margaret's bed under her quilt. And in the morning we got up and started the long work of becoming the people who lived at the Brackenfield Junction depot. The first weeks were the work of cleaning and small kindnesses. The people of Brackenfield came one or two at a time with covered dishes and stories. A woman named Clara, who had been Margaret's friend for 40 years, brought a casserole. An old man named Walter, who had worked the line under Henry, brought a box of photographs. I want to tell you that the safe was full of money, that I opened it and we were rich and all of our problems were solved. It was not full of money. It took me 3 weeks to open it. I tried numbers, the way people in those movies always try numbers. Birthdays, anniversaries, house numbers. Nothing worked. I tried for 21 nights, and I would think about Margaret kneeling in this exact spot, alone, for 39 years. On the 22nd night, I climbed up into the cupola instead. The sun was setting. The fields were the color of beaten copper. And as I sat in that small wooden seat, I noticed something. On the wooden frame around one of the cupola windows, scratched into the wood in tiny numbers, was a date. November 23rd, 71. The day Margaret had moved into the depot. The day, I would later learn, that Henry had finished rebuilding the caboose for their son. I went down. I tried the combination. 11, 23, 71. The safe opened. Inside was a manila envelope, 3 small ledger books, and a leather pouch. The envelope contained the original deed to the depot and to the 11 acres surrounding it, and to a second parcel of land, 120 acres of woodland that ran quietly along the old spur line that Henry had purchased in 1969, and that had been forgotten about by everyone, including the county tax assessor, for 55 long years. The paper was yellowed at the edges, brittle in the way that important things become brittle when they have been waiting too long to be found. I held it in both hands, afraid that if I gripped it too hard it would crumble, and I read it 3 times before I believed what it said. The land was clear. There were no liens, no disputes, no complications. It was ours. After everything. After 14 months of barely surviving, after the eviction notices folded into my back pocket like shameful secrets, after the nights of lying awake listening to my son breathe, and counting the days we had left, it was simply, cleanly, impossibly ours. The ledger books contained Henry's records, kept in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been typeset. One of them was a record of railroad bonds, savings instruments that he had purchased carefully, deliberately, in his son's name, in trust, throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s. He had bought them the way a man plants trees. He knows he will never sit under. He had bought them for a future he believed in, for a child he loved, and then life had moved on and the bonds had sat in the dark, in the quiet, accumulating interest the way that forgotten things sometimes do, not disappearing, not diminishing, but growing slowly in the silence. They had been sitting for over 40 years. I took the ledger to a financial advisor in the county seat, a cautious man in a beige office who looked at the numbers twice before he spoke. He told me the bonds, if they were still valid, would be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $94,000. I sat in the chair across from his desk and did not say anything for a long time. Outside his window, a flag was moving in the wind. I watched it and thought about Henry, who had never met his grandson, buying bonds in a name that did not yet mean anything to him, saving for a life he would never see. The leather pouch contained letters. Letters Henry had written and never sent. Letters to Margaret. Careful, agonized letters, written in the same small hand as a ledger, on paper that had gone soft with age. Letters apologizing. Letters explaining. Letters that circled the same wound again and again, approaching it and retreating from it, the way you approach a fire that is still too hot to touch. Taken together, read in order. They told the story of a man who had done a terrible thing in a moment of pride, or fear, or weakness. I never learned exactly which, and would spend every remaining year of his life unable to undo it. The last line of the last letter, written in a hand slightly less steady than the others, was, "I will write to her tomorrow." He had not. Tomorrow had come and gone for 31 years after that final letter, and he had never written it. And now he was gone, and Margaret had waited, and the letters had waited, and somehow they had all ended up here, in this leather pouch, in this locked caboose, at the end of this rusted track, waiting for a woman who had never heard of Brackenfield Junction to come and find them. We did not become rich. I want to be honest about that, because this is not that kind of story. The bonds, after taxes and fees and the cautious man's careful calculations, came to a little over $70,000. But $70,000, when you've been surviving on nothing, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, an enormous thing. It was enough to fix the roof that had been leaking since the first autumn, enough to pay the property taxes for the next 10 years, without lying awake doing arithmetic, enough to buy a used pickup truck that ran reliably and a tractor that mostly worked and needed only the kind of attention that a person willing to learn could give it, enough, in time, to begin restoring the depot itself, room by room, wall by wall, season by season, as a small museum of railroad history that gave the town of Brackenfield Junction something it had not had in a long time, which was a reason to exist again. We opened the museum in the spring of our second year. Walter cut the ribbon. He was 81 years old, and he wore a BOLO tie, and he cried a little, and then he pretended he had not, and I pretended I had not seen it. By the third year, we were receiving school groups on field trips, and I would stand at the back of the depot and watch a teacher try to hold the attention of 25 9-year-olds, and I would feel something moving inside me that I had stopped expecting to feel. It took me a while to recognize it. It was a sense that the future was a thing we were building, not a thing that was happening to us, not a force coming toward us that we could only brace against, but something we were actively constructing, with our hands, in a place that had been waiting for us. Eli grew up there. He was quiet, the way his father had been quiet, the same particular quality of stillness, the same habit of watching before speaking, the same patience with difficult things that most people give up on. He worked on the model trains in the caboose with the same focused, unhurried attention his father had once given to the model trains in our garage, back in the life we had lived before. He learned the names of the locomotives. He learned which cars had run on which lines and in which decades. He learned things I did not teach him, from books he found and from conversations with old men in town who had worked the rails and were glad, finally, to have someone young and genuinely interested to talk to. The summer he was 15, he and an old man named Gerald, who had worked for the railroad for 37 years and whose hands still moved like they were gripping something even when they were empty, spent 3 months restoring the old boxcar that had sat rusting at the edge of the property. They sanded it down to the bare wood, down to nothing, working in the heat of July and August without complaint. And then they repainted it the deep, particular red it had been when it had run on the line, decades before either of them had been born. When it was finished, Gerald stood back and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said it looked right. That was all he said. But I watched his face, and I understood that some things can be restored, and that the restoration of a thing is its own kind of grief and its own kind of joy, and that Eli, at 15, already knew this. He is 20 years old as I write this. He is away at university, studying engineering. He wants to be the man who fixes broken rail lines, who goes to the places where the infrastructure has failed and figures out how to make it work again. He says that the way his father used to say things he meant deeply, quickly, plainly, with his eyes on the table rather than on your face, as if the thing he is saying is too important to perform. But I see what he is doing. I have always been able to see what he is doing. He is building something to take the place of what was taken. He is making himself into someone who can be useful to broken things. His father would have understood this immediately. His father would have been proud in that same quiet, eyes-on-the-table way. And the caboose is still there. We never changed it. We talked about it once, in the early days, whether we should update it or incorporate it differently into the museum. And then we both, Eli and I, went quiet at the same time, and we never talk about it again. We left the bunks made up with the old blankets. We left the toys in the wooden chest. We left the picture of Margaret holding her baby on the small desk by the window, where the light comes in sideways in the late afternoon and falls across her face in a way that makes her look like she is about to say something. It is the room my husband slept in when he was a small boy, on visits he never told me about, in a life he carried quietly inside him. His grandmother kept it for 39 years. I see no reason to change it now, and I do not think I ever will. Grief is a locked room. When my husband died, the room I lived in for 14 months was a locked room with no windows, and I could not find a key, and I moved through my days performing the actions of living, cooking, driving, answering emails, folding laundry, while being entirely, completely absent from them. I thought I was going to live in that room for the rest of my life. I thought the lock was permanent. I thought I had lost a part of myself that knew how to be in the world. But here is what I have learned, slowly and with difficulty. Sometimes the key is held by someone else. Sometimes it is held by a woman you have never met, a woman who has been carrying it on a chain around her neck for 40 years, who has been waiting without knowing she was waiting for someone to come and take it from her. Sometimes the way out of your locked room is to walk into someone else's, to discover that someone's been sealed inside a locked room for far longer than you have, and that the way out for both of you is not to break the door down, but to open it together, carefully, from the inside. Margaret had been in a locked room for 31 years. I had been in one for 14 months. Eli, my quiet, watchful, 10-year-old boy, who grieved in the spaces between things, who grieved by getting smaller and taking up less room, and trying not to be a burden to the parent who was already carrying so much, was in one too. And he was so small, and he was so brave. And I will never, for the rest of my life, stop being grateful that he was the one who found a door and opened it. He needed something bigger than his grief. He needed a place where his father had also once been a child, stumbling and uncertain and beloved. He needed to know that there had been someone else in the world who had loved his father the way he loved him. Not as a husband or a colleague or a neighbor, but simply, fiercely, as a child loves the person who is everything to them. He found that in the locked caboose at the end of the rusted track, and in finding it, he gave it to me. If you have ever lost someone, if you're living right now in a locked room and the walls feel like they are permanent, I want to say this to you as plainly as I can. Children grieve differently than we do. They grieve in silence. They grieve by disappearing a little at a time. They grieve by watching your face to see if you are okay before they allow themselves to feel anything. You cannot reach them by talking. You cannot reach them by being strong. You cannot reach them by managing the situation correctly. What you can do, sometimes, is take their hand, walk with them out into the tall grass at the end of the day, when the light is going and everything is turning golden and soft, and let them lead, because they know where the locked place is. They have been looking at it the whole time. They have been waiting for you to be ready to go there with them. Mine led me to a caboose at the end of a rusted track in a town I had never heard of. Yours might lead you somewhere different. A garage that still smells like him. An attic full of her handwriting. A shoebox in the back of a closet that holds 40 years of small, ordinary evidence of a life fully lived. But what is inside, I promise you, is not only the grief. It is also the love that the grief was made from. And when you finally turn the key, when you finally let yourself walk into that small, dusty waiting room, you will find that the love has been there the whole time, patient, folded, kept, like a child's drawing a wooden chest, on top of the toys, placed carefully by someone who believed, even then, that you were coming. What is the locked place in your life? What is the door you've been walking past, telling yourself you will open it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? I want you to know that the door is not as heavy as you think it is. The lock is not as rusted as you fear. The key is closer than you believe. Sometimes it is in a tin in a desk drawer that sticks. Sometimes it is in the hand of a child who has been holding it out to you, quietly, for longer than you know. If this story reached you, tell me in the comments. Tell me about the door you opened. Tell me about the door you are still standing in front of. We are all of us walking through tall grass at the end of the day, looking for the small red rust-streaked place where what we lost has been waiting for us, patient and folded and kept in the love we thought was gone. It was never gone. It was only locked, and somewhere someone is carrying the key.